Test 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Hop. Et salut à tous et bienvenue sur ce petit live. On va essayer de créer notre premier jeu sur GameMaker Studio 2. Du coup j'ai vu que c'était un petit logiciel qui était sur Steam, il me tentait un petit peu. Et en gros après j'ai vu qu'il y avait Atomium, il avait fait des vidéos mais c'était il y a très longtemps, je n'en avais même pas entendu parler. Du coup je me suis dit que j'allais tenter le petit logiciel et son tuto pour voir ce que ça allait donner. Du coup je me suis dit allez on se lance. Tac tac tac. Donc j'ai déjà préalablement téléchargé le logiciel et tout ce qui est tutoriel asset, les sprites et les sondes. J'ai juste lancé le logiciel, je me suis inscrit sur le site quoi. Comme on peut le voir sur le layer. Alors,
video games, and in this tutorial series I'm going to be showing you step by step how to write your very first video game in GameMaker Studio 2 using GML code. So throughout this series we're going to be building a top-down action game that will look something like this, and it's going to have a player and a score and some baddies to shoot at. We're going to keep it really simple and low level, but hopefully we're going to teach you just enough about the key mechanics of GameMaker so that you can then go off and start making just about whatever you can imagine. So what we're actually going to try and achieve in this part of the tutorial is we're just going to create a player object on the screen that we can move around. That's it, we're just going to make a little player, move them around the screen, and that's all you'll be able to do. In order to do that, we need to create a couple of things. The first thing we need to make is a sprite for our player, okay? It's going to basically be the image that represents him. The sprite is just any kind of image in your game. So right click where it says sprites and hit create, and that will create a sprite editor inside the workspace. It's worth noting that you can move around the workspace at any time just by holding the middle mouse button and dragging around. You can hold control and zoom in and out, basically infinitely in all directions. Okay, so here is our sprite. I'm going to first of all give it a name. I'm going to call it SPR underscore player. Okay, my naming convention there is to just, and I use this for all different types of resources, is to basically use 3 letters that represent what type of resource it is, followed by an underscore, followed by some name that's relevant to whatever that resource happens to be. This is going to be for our player, so it's called our player sprite, okay? So next up I actually just want to actually import our player sprite into project. This is our player sprite, spinning UFO disc, and if you're watching this series on YouTube, you can download all of the assets used throughout the series from the video description. If you're watching it from inside the IDE, all those resources should be there for you. So the sprite editor shows us our sprite.
Ok, donc ça je l'ai déjà fait. J'ai déjà tout téléchargé quoi. Attends, je vais mieux mettre ça. Tac. En fait, c'est ça qui est pas bon. Allez, on va essayer de faire un truc propre. Tac. Alors, il avait dit d'aller dans Sprite. Alors, pourquoi je ne vois pas le logiciel là? C'est bizarre, il devrait être visible. Alors, on va essayer de le remettre. Tac. Voilà. C'est bizarre, j'avais le logiciel mais il avait disparu. C'est pas grave. Voilà, allez, on va continuer du coup. Juste vérifier un truc, c'est que si je fais ça et que je fais ça, c'est bon, j'arrive à revenir sur la... Ok. Allez, du coup il avait dit d'aller dans Sprite, il avait dit d'aller dans tac, écrire player. Ensuite il a fait importer, tutoriel ressources, image, il a pris ça, ouvrir, oui, et il avait dit de mettre ça centré.
Here that we've imported our image, and down here at the bottom it would be showing us multiple frames if this were an animated sprite. Say if we imported a GIF or imported a number of frames, all the frames would show down here, and you can play and preview that animation from here. You can also go to edit the...
Ok, donc ça c'est le truc image par seconde.
image with the built-in image editor, but we're not going to touch on that in this particular part. You can also, if you just click around the image, you see I'm moving around this crosshair. The crosshair indicates the origin point for our sprite, okay? The origin point is basically considered the center point of your sprite, and you'll see why later on as we start to do more things, and you see how sprites work in the game. To see why it's important to make sure that origin point is correctly positioned. But for now, just make sure that you, by just using this drop-down list up here, that you select middle center, and it'll automatically line itself up there. As I say, by just using this drop-down list up here, that you select middle center, and it'll automatically line itself up there. As I say, you can click around to place it manually, or you can type in specific coordinates for it up here in the top if you want to. So now that we have our sprite, the next thing we want to do is create our player object. Okay, objects are where we actually define all the interactivity and logic in the game, okay, and make these lovely images that we've put into the game actually do things. Okay, so I'm going to right click in objects and hit create, and then I'll...
Ok, donc je vais tester ça. Tac.
Pop up an object editor for us down here and scroll us to it automatically. I'm going to call it obj_player, as I said earlier, and you can see that naming convention. And
alors, objet, créer un objet. Tire bas, player.
And why we're doing that now, so we can distinguish between the player and the player sprite and the player object, okay? The next thing I want to do is actually link this object to the sprite that we just created. So over here where it says sprite, by default an object doesn't have any sprite, in which case it would be invisible in the game, but we're going to link this to spr_player. Okay, so now we have this object. I mean, we haven't actually set up any logic for him yet, but we'll do that in a second. Let's put him into the game world and actually see the game for the first time. So over here on the resource tree, you'll notice a category called rooms. If you actually open that up, you'll notice a room's already been created for you, just called room 0. We create this room for you by default because every GameMaker game needs to have at least one room in order to be able to actually run.
Salut Luc Ivan, comment vas-tu? Ouais, j'essaye de créer un jeu. Du coup, j'essaie une version d'essai d'un logiciel de codage et là comment dire, je tâtonne en regardant des tutos anglais quoi.
If I double click that, it'll open up the room editor. As you can see, this gets its own workspace, okay? It's separate from the main workspace, and it allows us to actually define everything in our rooms. Rooms can be thought of best probably as the levels or screens of your game. They're kind of containers where you organize and distribute.
Bon, je trouve que ça peut être sympa d'essayer de passer de joueur à développeur pour voir un peu ce que les mecs y font, quelles problématiques ils ont et tout, mais bon là j'en suis pas du tout là quoi, je suis vraiment au tout début là, je viens à peine de prendre des ressources pour créer un perso. Donc dans sprite là j'ai mis SPR player pour dire sprite player, là dans object player, et en gros c'est l'objet c'est le joueur et le sprite c'est l'apparence qu'il a quoi. Ouais, du coup ça faisait très longtemps que je cherchais un peu faire un truc un peu comme ça, donc
all your different objects and tiles and backgrounds and so on and so forth to sort of arrange the different elements of your video game. So I'm just at the moment we just have this default big.
Mais c'est assez moi j'avais déjà fait un peu de codage, mais tu sais j'avais fait du web mastering en fait. J'avais jamais fait de codage de jeu quoi.
Blank rectangle, okay? We can turn this grid off. This is what it will actually look like in the game. That grid's just there to help you place things. And if I go ahead and just click and drag our player object, you can see it pops up in the world here, and I can just let go of the mouse and place him there. If I hold Alt while I have an object selected in the resource tree, I can actually sort of paint them all over the place, but we only want the one player. Now we actually have everything we need to run the game for the first time and see our majestic, very complicated creation. Yeah, there it is, just a big black rectangle made in GameMaker Studio 2 with a player that doesn't do anything in the middle of the screen, okay? Congratulations, you've made your first video game, kind of. So nothing actually happens in here, so that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so now we actually need to go back to our player object, so the quickest way to do that is...
Il est marrant le mec qui a fait comment dire, le tuto, c'est un mec en gros, il faisait des tutos pour la version 1 du logiciel et tout, et vu qu'il a fait du bon boulot, en gros l'entreprise l'a recruté, tu sais.
Just double click on obj_player.
Et genre là le gars il a fait une blague du genre félicitations, t'as fait ton premier jeu. Genre t'as créé ton perso quoi.
And it'll bring us straight back to our workspace exactly where we left off. Okay, you can see we've got this events window here and it doesn't have anything in it yet. This is where we set up all of the actual logic and interactivity for our objects and therefore our game. An event can be best thought of as a when this happens, okay? So when something happens, events are triggered and then they
Salut
lead
Epitaph.
to actions which will appear over here. Okay, so events can be things like when the object is created, when the object is destroyed, every frame of the game that passes, pressing the left arrow key, and so on and so forth. The event that we're going to add is the step event. So go over to step, and there's 3 different types. We're just going to worry about the main step event. Okay, and click that, and you can see a big code window appears. So as I said, the best way to think of events and actions is in terms of events are when this thing happens, and actions are do this. Okay, so when the step event happens, do whatever code we put into this box. The step event's a special event. It's triggered every single frame of the game that passes, or every step of the game, which means basically a frame of the game. So at 60 frames a second, the step event will happen 60 times in 1 second, so it's just going to happen on a loop while this object is in the game world. Okay, so now we're ready to write our very first line of GML code. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make...
En gros là du coup sur Steam j'ai vu le logiciel là de création de jeux, tu sais bon il y en a plein, hein. Il y a GameMaker et tout. En gros j'ai fait un GameMaker, merde, c'est pas GameMaker que je voulais dire mais bon. Enfin il y en a plein d'autres quoi. Et en gros j'étais tombé sur celui-là, j'ai vu qu'il est souvent en promo et je voulais voir ce que ça donnait et j'ai vu qu'il y avait une version gratos. Et en tombant sur des versions gratos j'ai vu que t'avais... comment il s'appelle, Atomium, là il avait fait aussi des essais dessus et j'ai vu que c'était que ça avait l'air assez facile d'accès, du coup je me suis dit je vais tester quoi. Donc voilà. Je fais des petits essais là, j'ai téléchargé le logiciel hier soir, j'ai créé mon compte et tout. J'essaye de faire pareil quoi.
the player object move to the right just endlessly. So I'm going to take its x coordinate by just typing x equals and then itself plus 4. Okay?
Alors, x égale x plus 4. Point virgule.
You see x turned green there because it's a recognized property of the object, and 4 turned red just because it's a number. And we're just taking our x coordinate and setting it to be equal to itself plus 4. Okay, really, really simple thing to do. So every single frame of the game, modify our x coordinate by adding 4 to it. Now we can see this working already just if we run the game. And there he goes. Our object just moves to the right forever, and he goes off the screen, and he will just carry on moving to the right forever. No one can ever stop him until we close the game. Now he's been stopped. And as you can...
Ok, donc en gros là, c'est des coordonnées qui font que normalement le perso que j'ai créé doit se déplacer à l'infini vers la droite quoi. Et vu qu'il n'y a pas de mur, il s'arrête pas. Et le souci c'est que... Le souci c'est ça en fait, c'est vu que j'ai voulu réduire le truc là. J'ai pas tout l'écran en fait. Ah en fait je crois la putain de... Celle-là là, elle disparaît en fait. En fait j'ai l'impression que quand tu veux coder un truc, quand tu fais le test, l'image elle apparaît pas sur le stream. Parce qu'en gros, vu que ça ouvre une troisième fenêtre, la troisième fenêtre n'est pas là en fait. Alors, on va tester ça. Je crois que c'est ça. Du coup, hop. Et si je fais ça, normalement, ça va s'afficher. Ou pas. Ou pas. Bon, en fait, c'est la merde, il me faudra un troisième écran là, j'ai trop de fenêtres ouvertes là. Hum, hum, hum. Ah, ça s'affiche là. Ah, ça a mis un délai, mais ça s'affichait quoi. En gros, en fait, là, j'ai créé un perso qui est là. C'est juste un espèce de rond quoi. Et là, ce que j'ai écrit, en gros, c'est qu'il doit se déplacer vers la droite. Mais la fenêtre s'affiche pas sur le stream. Enfin, elle met un gros délai là pour le faire et le truc c'est que le temps qu'elle s'affiche, ça a déjà disparu quoi. Ouais, c'est pas grave, moi au moins je vois ce qui se passe, c'est pas. Ouais, ça va me servir à quoi? Ben, c'est pour moi personnellement, histoire de dire ouais, j'ai testé de créer un jeu, j'aime ou j'aime pas quoi. Après, c'est de l'apprentissage, c'est du codage.
See, I added this semicolon on the end of x equals x plus 4, I forgot to mention. That's just the standard good practice way to signify.
Tu sais, t'en as, ils streament du dessin, ça leur sert à quoi? Ben, ils font du dessin quoi. Il y en a, ils font du codage, ben, ils font du codage, il y en a, ils jouent, ben, ça leur sert à quoi de jouer? C'est pour tester d'apprendre un truc. C'est pour voir si le logiciel il est sympa, s'il m'intéresse ou pas. Là, je fais un tuto, le tuto de base, hein. C'est le premier tuto, il fait 17 minutes.
To GameMaker that this line of code has officially ended. Okay, there's only a couple of edge cases where this will specifically be very important to make sure you let GameMaker know where your line properly ends, but it's very good practice because of those.
Lol. Ouais, t'inquiète. Hein.
Edge cases to make sure you always do it. So GameMaker would be absolutely fine if I just typed x equals x plus 4. It would do the exact same thing, and I could go down here and type more lines of code, and it wouldn't matter that I didn't put the semicolon on the end. But it's very good practice to do so. Will matter in a few edge case scenarios that you'll learn about as you learn more about coding. And is also generally good practice throughout code and programming in general. It's a very standard practice to have some official signatory way of ending a line, and it usually is a semicolon. So now we want to make it a bit more complicated than this. The game still isn't really very interesting. So what we want to do is make it so that instead of just moving 4 pixels to the right every single frame of the game, we only move 4 pixels to the right if the user is pressing the right arrow key. Okay, we're going to start to build up our movement controls. So how do we do that? Well, let's bring this down here for a second. And what we're going to do is we're going to use what's called an if statement. Okay, it's a function of GameMaker. If I type I and then F, you can see it turns yellow the moment it becomes the word if. It's a built-in function, and you can tell any built-in function, like if I just type one randomly underneath, because it'll turn yellow immediately afterwards. And most of these require you to provide some sort of data or info, what's called arguments to them, okay? And you do that by opening a pair of brackets and closing them and typing whatever that information is in those pair of brackets. For an if statement, what it does is it checks a condition, and that's the condition you apply in the inside the brackets, and it says if that condition is true, perform the following. Okay, so think of it like a mini event inside the event. Okay, we're going to check to see if some condition happens to be true at this point in time on this particular frame when this is run, then perform whatever code we want to come afterwards. Okay, we can either type code immediately afterwards, or we can open a pair of curly braces like this and perform a ton of code inside them. Okay, and then if whatever happens in here is true, this stuff gets carried out. Okay, but we only need the one line for now, so inside this pair of brackets what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another function to check to see whether or not our arrow key is being pressed. Okay, it's called keyboard underscore check. Okay, you can see that then turns yellow in the exact same way. And then because it's a function, it also requires an argument, so I'm going to open and close another pair of brackets, and inside this pair of brackets I'm going to tell it which key I want it to check. It's our right arrow key, and we represent that with vk underscore right. Okay, now you might be thinking, oh, keyboard check vk right, I mean, I was with you at if, but how am I supposed to remember all these things? But trust me that it really isn't it seems intimidating now, but it gets a lot easier the more you practice, and you can always refer to the documentation in our help menu, and there's a full list of every single command available to you with descriptions of what they all do, so you can look them up for reminders or to seek out functions you might not know exist yet. There's plenty of functions I don't even know about in GameMaker Studio too. But it does get a lot easier over time. For now, you just have to sort of stick with it and try and learn it, and I will show you and explain to you each line of code as we use them. So now that we've typed this line out, what I'm going to do is, because at the moment these two things are happening separately, so it's doing this if check, then doing nothing, and then just moving those 4 pixels to the right. So I want to put this statement on the end of this if statement, okay? So when this if statement happens, it says if whatever happens inside this bracket is true, which happens to be keyboard check vk right, which will be true when we're pressing the right arrow key and will be false whenever we're not, or 0 and 1, whichever way you'd like to think of it. If that stuff is true, then perform the following, which is x equals x plus 4. Now if we run the game, you can see when I press the right arrow key, we move to the right. You'll just have to take my word for it and the sounds of my keyboard to know that it's when I'm pressing the right arrow key, but hopefully you guys...
Ok, du coup, ben, quand j'appuie sur droit là, ça marche. Ok. Donc, keyboard check. Du coup, après, je pense t'as pareil pour les manettes et tout, mais bon. Je vais déjà faire au clavier. Hein.
underscore left, it's the appropriate constant there, when the up arrow key is being pressed, and when the down arrow key is being pressed. Okay, and now the correct response to each one of those is not x equals x plus 4, but for the left it's x equals x minus 4. Okay, so we're going to subtract 4 from our x coordinate every single frame to move us to the left. And for up, we don't want to be working with our x coordinate, we want to be working with our y coordinate. Okay, that's our vertical coordinate. The lower it is, the higher you are up the screen, and the higher it is, the further down the screen you are. Okay, so since we want to move up, we want to move to a lower y position, so we want to subtract 4 from y. And then when we want to move down, we want to move up our y coordinate, okay, which will move us further down the screen. Just think of it this way: x, y of 0, 0 is the top left of your screen. Okay, so in order to move further to the right, we increase our x coordinate, and to move further down, we increase our y coordinate, and so on. Now, once you put all those things in, you can run the game again, and in order to move further.
Bon, je vais faire des copier-coller, ça ira plus vite. Hein. Sinon j'aurais écrit tout. Okay. Keyboard check. VK. On va voir ce que ça donne. Là, quand je fais droite, ça va à droite, gauche, à gauche. Là, ça monte et ça descend. Donc ça fonctionne. Tac, nickel.
To the right, we increase our x coordinate, and to move further down, we increase our y coordinate, and so on. Now, once you put all those things in, you can run the game again. We're presented with our black screen, our player again, and now I can move around. Just to round this out, I'm going to do one more thing on top of this, okay? I'm going to actually make it so, just to be a bit more interesting, we'll make the player point towards our current mouse coordinate, okay? So as opposed to just sort of floating around the screen and with this sort of line in the middle, we're going to make it actually sort of angle itself to face towards wherever our mouse is on the screen. So how do we do that? Well, we can modify the facing of our image, or like the rotation of our image, by typing image_angle. See, that turns green in the same way our x coordinate turns green and our y coordinate turns green. It's a built-in property of the object, okay? It's a built-in object variable that we can change and manipulate to do certain things. Okay, our image angle by default is 0, and it goes from 0 all the way to 360. Okay, 0 is considered to be facing to the right, and so you increase that by any number of degrees to face that degree direction. Okay, so the direction we want to point, and remember this happens every single frame of the game, so this will be constantly updated, is point_direction. You see that turns yellow. It's a function, meaning it's going to return a value based on values that we put into it. Okay, opening a bracket and closing a bracket because we're going to put some data in here. You can see at the bottom it actually tells you what data we need to provide. We need to provide an x coordinate, we need to provide an x and a y coordinate, so a position in space and a second position in space, okay, and then it works out the angle between them. So we're going to take our current x and y coordinate as the first coordinate, so that's wherever we happen to be on the screen is what we've been using to move around, and we're going to take the coordinates of our mouse, which we can receive just by typing mouse_x. You can see that's also green, it's a built-in property, and mouse_y. Okay, so those variables always, you can't actually change mouse x and mouse y. What they do is they always contain, every single frame, they always contain the mouse coordinates. Okay, so the mouse's x coordinate and the mouse's y coordinate in the current room. Okay, so we can take our current object's coordinate, the mouse's coordinates, and we're going to find the angle between them and set that to be our sprite's angle. Okay, and that line with a semicolon, and run the game. And after it's compiling, you find we move our mouse around, the player faces towards our mouse. Okay, and we can still move around with the arrow keys. Okay, so those variables always.
Ok, donc là en gros, c'est pour que l'objet puisse tourner quoi. Alors, image.
You can't actually change mouse x and mouse y. What they do is they always contain, every single frame, they always contain the mouse coordinates. Okay, so the mouse's x coordinate and the mouse's y coordinate in the current room.
On va tester du coup. Du coup, je peux toujours me déplacer. Ok, nickel.
Okay, so we can take our current object's coordinate, the mouse's coordinates, and we're going to find the angle between them and set that to be our sprite's angle. Okay, and that line with a semicolon, and run the game. And After it's compiling, fine, we move our mouse around, the player faces towards our mouse. Okay, and we can still move around with the arrow keys, and so on. So we have our basic movement on the go here. There's a lot we'll change about it, and we'll make it different in various ways as we carry on with the series. But for now, this is just a player moving around the screen. That's the very, very basics of most of the main elements of GameMaker. And we'll see you in part 2, where we'll look at actually creating some projectiles and doing some more interesting things. Thanks a lot for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Hope you'll be watching the rest of the series, and hope you find it all very useful. We can't wait to see what sort of awesome stuff you guys get up to and make with GameMaker Studio 2. Hello everybody, I'm Sean.
Donc voilà, là j'ai fini le tuto 1. Donc c'était créer un perso. Bon, enfin créer un perso. Ils te fournissent l'image quoi du perso, c'est le créer dans le jeu, faire des déplacements. Et en gros que ça tourne autour de toi. Le truc c'est qui est pas mal là, que j'avais pas testé, c'est que tu peux faire des diagonales en fait. Du coup je peux faire droite, gauche, haut, bas et diagonale quoi. Et tourner autour. Ça c'est le genre de truc qu'ils ont fait pour dans les trucs comme CS 2D, tu sais. Allez. J'attends un petit peu histoire de faire charger la vidéo pour pas laguer en même temps que le stream là.
And welcome back to part 2 of our beginner tutorial.
Your first game projectile.
So we're already off to a good start. We've got our player object that we can move around with the arrow keys, and it points himself towards the mouse cursor. But it's still not really very much of a game. It's not really very much to look at in general, really. So what we're going to do in this part is we're going to create a bullet that our player object can shoot around and create some lovely fireworks. So the first thing I'm going to do, just like before when we made our player object and its sprite, is we're going to make a new sprite for our bullet. So I'm going to right click in sprites and hit create. It'll take us back to our workspace and open up the sprite editor. And I'm just going to call this one SPR_bullet.
Putain, je vois rien du coup. Ça me met que c'est en 720, mais je vois pas le ce qu'il écrit vu que c'est flou.
Click import and just bring in my bullet sprite.
Alors, l'idée dans sprite, créer un sprite, SPR, tirba, bullet, tac.
Click yes to that, and see it brings it in fine.
Importer.
And then I'm just going to place the origin somewhere around here in the center of this sprite. I'm not going to use the drop down middle center anymore, so we don't want the origin to be there. I want kind of to mark the center point of this sprite as being around here, inside the sort of main chunk of the bullet.
C'est peut-être pas le bon que j'ai ramené là. Si j'ai que ça, important.
Self rather than sort of the. I'm just going to place the origin. So I'm going to make a new sprite for our bullet. _bullet. I'm going to click import and just bring in my bullet sprite. Click yes to that, and see it brings it in fine. And then I'm just going to place the origin somewhere around here in the center of this sprite. I'm not going to use the drop down middle center anymore, so we don't want the origin to be there. I want kind of to mark the center point of this sprite as being around here, inside the sort of main chunk of the bullet itself, rather than sort of the trailing blaze coming from behind it. So I'm just going to click on the image just to place that origin about there. I could type it in precisely with these coordinates if I want to, but it's easy enough just to place it there. So that's that sprite. So now that we have a sprite for that bullet, you can guess what we might want to do next, and that's create a new object for the bullet. So I'm going to right click in objects and hit create. These coordinates if I want to, but it's easy.
Si je descends ça là. Merde. De toute façon, c'est en faisant des tests que t'apprends, hein, donc... Vas-y, on va mettre 180, genre. Ok, ça agrandit ça. Waouh. Là, t'as carrément un truc pour modifier le dessin, là. Ok. On va essayer de pas faire le con. Donc là, si je mets 150, ça fait quoi? Donc là, on va mettre 100. Je sais pas, t'as un putain de dézoom en fait. Si je mets 100 et 100. Ouais, je vais faire déjà comme il a fait, pas me prendre la tête. Peut-être il a juste fait ça en fait, le mec.
Enough just to place it there. So that's that sprite. So now that we have a sprite for that bullet, you can guess what we might want to do next, and that's create a new object for the bullet. So I'm going to right click in objects and hit create, and that'll create a new object editor for us. I'm just going to link that where it says no sprite to spr_bullet, so we have the bullet attached to the sprite, and call this obj_bullet, just in the exact same way that we set up the player object to begin with. Now we don't actually need to set up any events or actions in here just yet. What we're going to do is come back to our player object, and we're going to set up the code in here to dynamically create instances of obj_bullet on the fly in the game. So whenever we click the mouse button, we'll create a copy or an instance of this object in the game world. So the first thing we can do is we can actually get rid of this this comment at the top here that says you can write your own code in this editor. We don't need that anymore. But what we can do is actually just write a comment of our own, just to label what each section of this code does, now that we're starting to add a bit more to it. Trust me, it's very easy to forget what certain areas of your code do, and leaving comments in your code, very easy way to track that. You write in a comment, it doesn't actually do anything in your game, it just serves as literally a comment or a note in your code. You do it by just typing 2 slashes and you can see the text turns green after that, and anything you write, you can write anything after that, anything you want, and it won't be run or interpreted by the game as an instruction. So I'm just going to write moving around there, because that's what that chunk of code does. It controls us moving around and looking at the mouse. Then underneath that, I'm going to create a new comment that just says shoot, okay? And the code we put here is going to control our shooting. So what I want to do is check to see if the mouse button, the left mouse button is being pressed, and if it is, create a copy of obj_bullet at the position of the mouse for now. We'll see what that does. So I'm going to use an if statement just as I did before, and type if, and then open brackets just as I did before. And this time, instead of keyboard check, I'm going to write mouse_check_button, and open brackets and type mb_left. Okay. This condition here is doing exactly what I just said we're going to do. We're going to check to see if the left mouse button is currently being pressed, and if all that is true, then whatever we type after this line of code will happen. But sometimes when you write an if statement, you want to do more than just one thing if that statement is true. We only want to do one thing initially here, but we may want to do more later. So what I'm going to do is, instead of simply writing the command immediately after the line, is I'm going to open a pair of curly braces. And by doing this after the if statement, instead of carrying out whatever happens here, we're going to carry out whatever happens inside these curly brackets. Now, it's also common practice when you do this to press tab once for every time you open up a pair of these brackets, so that whenever I type my code in here, we can see very clearly when reading the code that it's part of this if statement. If I type everything at the same indentation like this, it becomes harder to see where your if statements start and end, even though the brackets are there, and it just makes it a little bit more human readable to just press tab once and just sort of indent the code that happens inside your if statements. So what do we want to actually happen when we press the left mouse button? We want to create an instance of our bullet object in the game world. So what I'm going to write is instance underscore create underscore layer. And then, as with most functions like this, you typically have to open and close a pair of brackets, and usually have to supply some sort of instructions or arguments to that function to tell it what to do. And you'll see when you write a function like this, GameMaker actually shows you at the bottom here exactly what arguments and values and information that particular function needs. So as you can see, this one needs an x coordinate, a y coordinate, a layer ID, which we'll come to in a second, and the name of the object that you want to create. So for the x and y, we're just going to use the coordinates of the mouse. So just separated by commas here, I'm just going to type mouse underscore x, comma mouse underscore y, and that'll give us the x and y coordinates of our mouse. Now the next value that we need to supply is the layer. Now all instances in a GameMaker game are arranged by layers, and this is an important change between GameMaker Studio 2 and Studio 1. The layer an instance is on determines the order in which it is drawn to the screen. Each layer is set to a certain depth. Layers with a higher depth are drawn first, and therefore appear behind objects on layers with lower depths. You can create and manage layers from the room editor, which we will come to in a bit. For now, I'm literally just going to write layer, which will take the layer our player is currently on, and we'll create the bullets on that particular layer. After that, add another comma and just write obj underscore bullet. So that will create a bullet on the same layer as our player at the x and y coordinates of our mouse. So now if I go ahead and run the game, you can see if I hold the left mouse button, or if I just click the left mouse button, I can draw bullets all over the screen. See, we don't actually need to use this function to create bullets. If we really wanted to, we could create a fancy art game out of this. It's quite fun just to sort of draw these bullets all around the place. So that's how we create instances dynamically in the game world. So first of all, let's adjust this so instead of just creating the bullets at the mouse coordinates, we create them at our player object, because we're going to create them at the player and then cause them to shoot off by themselves, okay? So close the game now.
Franchement, le tuto il est bien fait quand même, je trouve. Après bon, c'est de l'anglais, donc c'est sûr qu'il y en a ils comprendront pas tout, mais... Du coup je peux tirer, je peux toujours me déplacer. Les sous-titres, c'est moi qui les active sur YouTube en fait. Ah, je les ai pas mis là?
And just where we wrote mouse
Je
X
suis un
and mouse
troll en
Y
fait.
before, just simply shorten that to X and Y, just as the same as we were referring to our players' X and Y coordinates when we were moving around. So now what we're going to do is open up Object Bullet, and I'll move our workspace down here, and add the create event this time. So differently from the step event, which runs every single frame of the game, currently at 30 frames a second, the create event only happens once, and that's just when the object is made for the first time.
Ouais, je les ai pas mis, je suis un troll. Alors, du coup... voilà. Ajouter un événement. Après il a fait créer du coup. On peut pas se déplacer là dans le truc. Ouais, tu dois y avoir un bouton, je pense quand même.
I'm just gonna write set up motion, because what we're gonna do is basically set it up so our bullet just flies off into the distance the moment it's made. First thing we want to do is get the direction for which we want to fire. Now the direction is gonna be based on our player's position and the position of the mouse, okay? It's gonna be the angle between the two. So we can get that just by typing direction equals point underscore direction. And we used this before, we just want to take two coordinates, an x and a y position and another x and y position, and work out the angle between them. So we're just going to use the x and y position of this bullet as it's just been made, so it'll be at where the player is, our x and y position, and the position of the mouse, so mouse underscore x and mouse underscore y, just as we've used before. Okay, but we don't want it to always be directly that angle. We want to sort of randomize it a little bit so it feels like we're sort of spraying the bullets a little rather than just shooting them directly at the mouse cursor, just to add a little bit of game feel. So I'm just going to type direction equals direction plus random underscore range, and then this generates a random value between two values that we give it. So I'm going to say -4 and 4. So we're going to add or subtract a value between -4 and 4 to our current direction, just to make it a bit more randomized. Then we're just going to give our bullet some base velocity and speed to begin with. So I'm going to type speed equals
Alors, direction. Quel point direction? Donc ça doit être selon où tu regardes avec ta souris. Après c'est direction égale direction plus random range, ça doit être de portée aléatoire. Hop, speed égale 16.
16, so there'll be 16 pixels per frame. It'll move in the direction we've just given it. And we're going to set our image angle, lastly, to be our direction, so the angle of the image adjusts to face the direction it's in, just as we've done with the player before. Now all we have to do is run the game, and we should find when we click the left mouse button that we shoot lots of lovely bullets everywhere, and now we create a nice sort of wheel fireworks display if I just sort of spin 16, so there'll be 16 pixels. Now all we have to do is adjusts to face.
Alors. Bon, ça marche pas. Genre, ouais, c'est pas... tu fais un jeu où tu dois esquiver, tu sais. Attends, j'ai fait de la merde sûrement. Alors, qu'est-ce que j'ai fait? Direction égale point tiré bas direction xy boost tiré bas x direction égale direction plus random range 4 machin speed égale 16 image angle égale direction.
The direction it's in, just as we've done with the player before. Now all we have to do is run the game, and we should find when we click the left mouse button that we shoot lots of lovely bullets everywhere, and the name of the object that you want to create.
J'ai dû oublier un truc, c'est pour ça. Shoot if mouse check button mb truc script layer.
So for the X and Y, we're just going to use the coordinates of the mouse. So just separated by commas here, I'm just going to type mouse underscore X, comma mouse underscore Y, and that'll give us the X and Y coordinates of our mouse. Now the next value that we need to supply is the layer. Now all instances in a GameMaker game are arranged by layers, and this is an important change between GameMaker Studio 2 and Studio 1. The layer an instance is on determines the order in which it is drawn to the screen. Each layer is set to a certain depth. Layers with a higher depth are drawn first, and therefore appear behind objects on layers with lower depths. You can create and manage layers from the room editor, which we will come to in a bit. For now, I'm literally just going to write layer, which will take the layer our player is currently on, and we'll create the bullets on that particular layer. After that, add another comma, and just write obj underscore bullet. So that will create a bullet on the same layer as our player at the X and Y coordinates of our mouse. So now if I go ahead and run the game, you can see if I hold the left mouse button, or if I just click the left mouse button, I can draw bullets all over the screen. See, we don't actually need to use this function to create bullets. If we really wanted to, we could create a fancy art game out of this. It's quite fun just to sort of draw these bullets all around the place. Top players X and Y coordinates when we were moving around. So now what we're going to do coordinates when we were moving. As coordinates, we create them at our player object, because we're going to create them at the player and then cause them to shoot off by themselves. Okay, so close the game now, and just where we wrote mouse X and mouse Y before, just simply shorten that to X and Y, just as the same as we.
En plus, il le zoome pas, ça.
We're referring to our players X and Y coordinates.
Instance create layer. En gros, il a viré mousse layer, il a mis ça.
Coordinates when we were moving around. So now what we're going to do is open up object bullet, and I'll move our workspace down here and add the create.
Bah, du coup, ça doit être ça que j'ai pas vu qu'il l'a fait en petit, et vu qu'il a pas zoomé sur le truc, j'ai pas pu le voir. Voilà. Parce qu'avant, en fait, ça tirait de mousse X et Y. Du coup, c'était selon où était placée ma souris. Du coup, je peux toujours me déplacer en plus. C'est fun, hein.
Event this time. So different. We want to sort of new layer for our bullets and create the bullets on that layer instead, so that they appear below our player as opposed to above. So let's fix that one now. Let's close this and go to our room editor, and we can see over here on the left our layers at the moment. We have instances and background. The background's a background layer.
Alors, après il va dans Room. Après il va dans Background.
Just designed specifically for sprites in the background and not object instances. You can also create more background layers, but we're interested in our instances layers at the moment. We have one by default that's just called instances, and that's where our player object currently sits. The instance of our player object currently sits in the game world. And what we want to do is create a new layer. So I'm going to click here, create new instance layer. You see it's called instances 1. I'm just going to rename it to bullets layer. Okay.
Alors, il a fait créer non, c'est pas ça, je crois.
Center, and do is create a new layer. So I'm going to click here, create new instance layer. You see it's called instances 1. I'm just going to rename it to bullets layer. Okay, press enter, and I'm going to drag it underneath instances so that the bullets, when we create them, will appear below this layer. So anything we create on bullets layer will appear below instances, because you can see if you look at depth at the bottom here, bullets layer is set to a depth of 100, whereas instances is set to 0. If we rearrange them like this, it intuitively makes it so that bullets layer is now 0 and instances would be 100. The higher the depth, the deeper into the screen the things will be drawn. They'll be drawn before anything else, so they'll be drawn behind other instances, okay? So we want the depth of our bullets layer to be higher than that of our instances, so we drag that underneath. So our bullets layer has the higher depth of 100, and instances has a depth of 0. Now all we have to do is change the layer that our bullets are being created on. So if we go back to our object editor for RubyJ_player, where we created the bullets in the first place, instead of just creating them on our current layer, let's type in the name of the layer we just made, which is bullets layer. And I've wrapped that in quotation marks because we have to pass the name of the layer in as a string. You can't just type bullets layer. You have to type it in quotation marks as a string for layers. That's just how layers operate at the moment. So if I run the game now, you find when you're shooting the bullets, they all appear below the player now instead of just on top of them, because they're being assigned to that layer, which has a higher depth than the layer our player is currently sitting on. The last thing we're going to cover in this particular part of the tutorial series is how to make those bullets not shoot in a continuous stream one every single frame. We're just going to slow it down a bit. They'll still fire constantly when you hold the mouse.
Du coup, tu profites bientôt ton week-end, Epitaph, vu qu'on est vendredi.
But they won't just fire one every single frame like that. We'll sort of create some space in between so that they fire sort of a bit more reasonably. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new event in our player object. By clicking add event, we're going to create the create event, similar to object bullet. And this line of any code we put in here is going to run when the instance of the player object is made for the very first time. Okay, so it's only going to happen once. What we're going to do is we're just going to write cooldown equals 0. What that
Du coup, je
means
parle
is
pas
we're
trop
basically
vu que
creating
j'essaye
what's called a variable.
de comprendre
so
ce qu'est le truc, ce que le tuto
to
fait.
equal 0. So now whenever we refer to cooldown in our code, we're basically referring to the number 0, and we can change the number that this holds and do any number of things with it. Variables very useful and very powerful, as we'll soon find out. Now if I come back to the step event, in here at the moment we're checking to see if the mouse button is held. Similarly, below where our player is currently sitting on. The last thing we're going to cover in this particular part of the tutorial series is how to make those bullets not shoot in a continuous stream one every single frame. We're just going to slow it down.
Moi, je suis généralement
They'll
réveillé
still
vers
fire
8
constantly when
heures,
you hold
donc...
the mouse button, but they won't just fire one every single frame like that. We'll sort of create some space in between so that they fire sort of a bit more reasonably. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new event in our player object. By clicking add event, we're going to create the create event, similar to object bullet. And this line of any code we put in here is going to run when the instance of the player object is made for the very first time. Okay, so it's only going to happen once. What we're going to do is we're just going to write cooldown equals 0. What that means is we're basically creating what's called a variable. Okay, so we're just assigning the word cooldown to equal 0. So now whenever we refer to cooldown in our code, we're basically referring to the number 0, and we can change the number that this holds and do any number of things with it. Variable variables are very useful and very powerful, as we'll soon find out. Now, if I come back to the step event, in here at the moment we're checking to see if the mouse button is held down every single frame of the game in the step event, and if it is, we're just going ahead and creating a bullet. But what we're going to do is create basically a small cooldown period. That's what that variable is going to be used for. So instead of just checking if the mouse is held down, we're also going to check to see if cooldown currently equals 0. In fact, we're actually going to check to see if it's less than 1 rather than 0. The reason for that will become clear in a second. So I'm going to type 2 ampersand symbols, which basically represents AND. So if mouse check button MB left and the following condition are true, then do this stuff, rather than just checking one condition. We have to open another pair of brackets for this condition. I'm going to write cooldown less than 1. Okay, so we're going to check to see if that variable that we just made, which is 0 at the moment, if it's less than 1, which it currently is, because that's what we've established it as 0, 0 is less than 1, then create our bullet object, okay? What I'm then going to do is set that cooldown to equal 3 after we've fired the bullet. Okay, and after that's happened, we'll no longer be able to shoot. So at the moment, if we were to run the game, we'd be able to fire 1 bullet because our cooldown is less than 1, but then cooldown will be set to 3, which is greater than 1, and we wouldn't be able to shoot bullets anymore because this would always return false. Alright, now in order to fix that, what we're going to do is outside of this code, write cooldown equals cooldown minus 1. So any frame where we're not shooting a bullet and setting it back to 3, the cooldown will slowly tick down by 1 every single frame until it is eventually less than 1 again, okay? And this is why we check less than 1 rather than equal 0, because we could go into minus numbers quite easily here. We're going about minus 1,000 or so because we've not fired in ages. But the all we want to check is that it's less than 1. And if it is, fire a bullet, set that cooldown back to 3, and then continue to slowly tick the cooldown down. So if I run the game now, and if I hold the left mouse button, you can see we fire, but at a slightly slower pace. Still firing quite a lot. If I increase the value that we set cooldown to, which I can demonstrate now, if I set this to say 10 and ran the game, it would mean we basically need to wait 10 frames between each bullet. So you can see it's firing much, much slower now.
Ok, donc là normalement, la vitesse de tir ça sera pas pareil. Du coup après il a mis 10. Du coup c'est super lent à 10. Ok, ça fonctionne.
Okay, so that's how you create simple projectiles. Now that we have a game where we have a player object and that player can shoot some bullets, the next part in the series is going to look at creating enemies for us to actually shoot at. Hope you've been enjoying the series so far, and I'll catch you guys next time. Hello everybody and welcome to part 3. In this part, now that we have our player object and he can shoot some bullets, our next logical step is to create something for him to shoot at. So we're going to create a green blob alien thing that's going to move towards the player, and if it touches the player the game will restart, but we can shoot them down before that happens, okay? But before we do any of that, our game currently is just set to the sort of standard GameMaker setting of 30 frames a second. We're going to change that, so we're going to make the game 60 frames a second, and we're going to smooth out some of this. You can see when the player rotates, like there's a little bit of sort of like pixelatedness or like artifacting happening on the edges of the sprite just from the way it's rotating. So we're just going to change one setting that'll make that much smoother, and it'll help out with all of our different sprites that face different angles, okay? So let's close that. In options in the resource tree, okay, just open that and you'll have a couple of things in here by default, main and Windows. Okay.
Dans options. Okay.
So double click on main first of all, and this will bring up our global game settings. You see the very top here, game frames per second. So this is different from GameMaker Studio 1.x, where you would have to set a target room speed per room, and that would sort of become your frame rate, right? Here we actually just set a target frame rate for the actual game. So change that from 30 to 60, okay, and hit apply. That will make the game 60 FPS, but before we run the game, in platform settings here, just select Windows, and this will bring up our Windows specific options, okay, which we could also access from down here in options just by double clicking on Windows. We're going to go ignore all this stuff for now, just go into graphics, okay, and turned off by default is interpolate colors between pixels. This was turned on by default in GameMaker Studio 1.x, but it's turned off by default here. You don't want to turn this on if you're using pixel art, okay, or if you're using like very crisp sharp pixel art, because if you do, you might run into problems where you see images blurring kind of at the edges, especially like if you rotate them or if they're between subpixels and so on, which you'll want to avoid. But if you're using kind of HD sprites like the ones we're using, it can be really useful to tick this because it'll give you a much sort of smoother finish when you rotate sprites around or do other things with them, okay? And you won't get any of that sort of sharp artifacting going on, okay? So click OK, and if we run the game now, we should find not only have we doubled our frame rate, but also our player sprite looks way smoother, okay? And you can see this all looks way
J'ai pas trop capté ce que ça a changé là, ce truc graphique. Ouais. Oh. Allez.
way better, okay, just from changing those two simple settings. Okay, so it's time to make our enemy object. Before we make the object, the first thing we want to do is create the sprite. Okay, so right click in sprites and hit create, just as we've always done. We're going to call this SPR underscore enemy, and I'm going to import this guy right here, this green enemy image. Yes, and make sure we...
Bon, ça on est habitué maintenant, créer un sprite, SPR-bas enemy. Importer, donc on va chercher l'image.
Center that origin, middle center. Okay, you can see the crosshair move to the right place, just exactly as we've done with our previous sprites. Okay, and then go ahead and close that. Right click in objects and hit create, and this object is going to be called obj underscore enemy. Make the sprite match just in the exact same way, SPR underscore enemy, so that this is now a blueprint for our enemy instances. Okay, and this is what is going to define how they behave. The first event we're going to add for our enemy object is actually the create event. Okay, so whenever an instance of the enemy object is created, and let's just go ahead, I'm just going to click this button, or you can also press F12, that will actually just unfold all of these sort of external docs and windows. You can bring them back individually just by clicking on each one, or you can bring them all back by clicking that again, or by pressing F12. I'm just going to close that down just to give us a bit more space to work with. Okay, so in the create event for our enemy, what I'm going to do is get rid of all this and type HP equals 5. Okay, and that's just going to be our first line. So all we're doing there is defining another variable, just as we did with cooldown in the episode on shooting. Okay, we're just picking an arbitrary word that we made up. I'm calling it HP, and I'm going to set it equal to 5. That's going to represent the hit points, okay, or the health points, or however you want to say it, of the enemy, so that when we take 5 HP worth of damage, the enemy will get destroyed, okay, just as with a lot of different types of games, I'm sure you can imagine. Okay, so that's just a simple variable, and we're going to set up another variable, this one called SPD, okay, going to be for speed. Don't type the word speed, as you can see that changes color because it's a built-in variable in GameMaker. Okay, if we were to set a speed, then the object would actually use that speed in the game, would actually move at the number we put into that at that many pixels per frame, which is not what we want. We just want to declare an arbitrary word that represents the idea of speed, or the concept of speed, and set it equal to a value. And we're going to use that value to move our object along later on. You'll see what I mean, okay? Just don't use the actual full word speed, use anything else you want, okay? I'm just using SPD. Next up, let's create the step event, okay? I'm just going to bring this over here. Add event step, okay? Again, get rid of this. And what I'm going to write in here is we're going to check to see if the player exists, and if the player does exist, move towards the player every frame, okay? So if, first of all, just asking GameMaker a question, if the following, instance underscore exists, okay? That's a built-in function, you can see it come up there, and you can see here what it's going to ask us for is just the name, what instance of what object exists, okay? So open brackets and define the object that we're looking for, which is obj underscore player. Close that bracket and then close the other bracket we just opened, okay, so you can see the pairs that we're opening and closing there. And then open and close a pair of curly braces, okay? So this line of code is very simply saying if any instance of obj underscore player exists, do whatever we put in here, okay? And if there aren't any, don't, okay? It's just a simple check to make sure we don't try and move towards a player if there isn't a player in the game for whatever reason, okay? Which is stuff we might do later. For now, it doesn't really matter either way, but it's a nice check to put in place ahead of time. So what do we want to put in here? Well, we want to actually move towards the player. So type move underscore towards underscore point. You can see that turns, which is obj underscore player. to a value, and we're going to use that value to move our object along later on. You'll see what I mean, okay? Just don't use the actual full word speed, use anything else you want, okay? I'm just using SPD. Next up, let's create the step event, okay? I'm just going to bring this up here. Add event step, okay? Again, get rid of this. And what I'm going to write in here is we're going to check to see if the player exists, and if the player does exist, move towards the player every frame, okay? So if, first of all, just asking GameMaker a question, if the following, instance underscore exists, okay? That's a built-in function, you can see it come up there, and you can see here what it's going to ask us for is just the name, what instance of what object exists, okay? So open brackets and define the object that we're looking for, which is obj underscore player. Close that bracket and then close the other bracket we just opened, okay, so you can see the pairs that we're opening and closing there. And then open and close a pair of curly braces, okay? So this line of code is very simply saying if any instance of obj underscore player exists, do whatever we put in here, okay? And if there aren't any, don't, okay? It's just a simple check to make sure we don't try and move towards a player if there isn't a player in the game for whatever reason, okay? Which is stuff we might do later. For now, it doesn't really matter either way, but it's a nice check to put in place ahead of time. So what do we want to put in here? Well, we want to actually move towards the player. So type move underscore towards underscore point. You can see that turns yellow. That's a recognized function. And at the bottom here, you can see what it's asking us for. It's asking us for an x coordinate, a y coordinate, and a speed at which to move. Okay, and this is why we created that variable earlier, SPD. The x position we want to move to is wherever our player happens to be. So obj underscore player dot x will return the x coordinate of the player. Should he be in the game, okay? And do the same thing again for his y coordinates. Obj underscore player dot y, comma again, and for the speed we type SPD, okay, which is going to return 1.5, which is the value that we set in the create event, okay? Simple as that. And then the last thing we want to do with this enemy every frame is change the angle of the sprite to face towards wherever it's moving so that he visibly appears to turn around and move. Okay, so I'm going to type image underscore angle equals direction, just as we did with the player when we were pointing him towards the mouse cursor. Okay. That's all we really need for the basic setup of our enemy object. Okay, so I'm just going to bring back the resource tree and go into the room editor. Okay, so on just the instances layer, that'll do for now. I'm just going to select obj underscore enemy and hold Alt, which also put him in my hand there, and then just click a few times to place a few of them into the room. You can just click and drag them out as well, as we've done before. But yeah, we just want just a nice handful of those in the room. Now, if I run the game, we'll find that they move towards the player, just like that, okay? We can't actually shoot them or do anything to them yet, so they look kind of menacing, unstoppable threat of green blobs, but then if they touch me, they all just kind of vibrate on the spot like that. They don't actually do anything. So that's what we're going to change now. We'll make it so if they collide with me, then that's it, that's game over. But if I shoot them, they lose hit points and eventually disappear. So let's open up the step event for our enemy object first of all. Okay, so bring that up, close this down. Okay, so this is just our step event from before. At the moment you can see in create we set a HP variable, but we don't do anything else with it. Okay, as far as the
Du coup, j'ai bien les monstres qui me pourchassent là. Mais je peux pas les buter. Ah, c'est fun quand même. Attends, je reviens vite fait, je ferme juste la fenêtre là. Ouais, il recommence à pleuvoir là. Là, je sais pas si chez toi il pleut ou pas, mais là il pleuvait de fou quoi.
game's concerned, HP just means 5, and that doesn't determine anything else in our game. So we want to say that if HP is less than or equal to 0, we're going to destroy this particular enemy. So if HP less than or equal to, that's just a mathematical symbol, 0, close bracket. Okay, so if that particular condition is true, we're not going to open a set of curly braces for this one because we only want to do the one thing. I know we technically did the same there, but we...
Ouais, l'orage, je pense que c'est un peu chez tout le monde ça. Ouais, en gros, en fait, tu fais tout dans objet quoi. Le sprite c'est l'image, l'objet c'est le, c'est en, à dire c'est un peu genre le contenant et le contenu quoi.
might want to do other things there at a later point. But if our hit points is less than or equal to 0, there's really only one thing we're ever going to want to do, and that's instance underscore destroy. So I'm just going to put it on the same line. When you put a thing just on the same line as an if statement like that, it'll just do that one condition, and it doesn't need curly braces, okay? It just does the one thing that you put after the condition in brackets, okay? So if our hit points are less than or equal to 0, we'll just destroy this particular instance. The reason I said less than or equal to 0 and rather than just equal 0 is, I don't know, maybe you subtract 3 hit points from the enemy when he's on 2 or whatever and you end up on -1. You don't want to like skip over 0 and not get destroyed because you're on minus health, etc. Okay, just little bits of logic that you might not necessarily have thought about if you're not used to doing game logic and so on. Less than or equal to 0 just helps us cover all the different situations that might occur. Okay, so that's set up, but right now there's no way the enemy will ever actually reach 0 hit points because we set hit points to be 5, right? There's nothing in our game that ever tells our hit points to reduce. So that's what we want to do now. So let's bring back the resource tree and go to the bullets object, okay? And we want to add an event for when the bullet object collides with our enemy objects, okay? So where's collision down here, and select obj underscore enemy. Okay, so the following code will run if any instance of obj underscore bullet detects a collision with any instance of obj underscore enemy. Now, what we want to do is find the specific enemy that's just been hit, the specific instance of that enemy, and reduce its HP. Now, any code we put in here just by default will apply to the bullet instance, but that's not what we want. We want to apply code to the enemy instance. Now, we can actually do that from inside this object, and the way we do that is using a with statement. Okay, you can see that turns yellow. What this does is it allows us to put in either the ID of an instance in the game or an object, and it can apply to all those objects, or like any kind of reference to a specific instance or object, and apply code to them or with them rather than with the object that's calling the code. So I'm going to type with. Now you might think I'm going to type with obj underscore enemy, right? Okay, with the enemy we hit, but that would apply to all instances of obj underscore enemy and not the one we just hit. The one we just hit, whenever we run a collision event, the instance of the other object involved in the collision rather than the object calling the event is stored in the word other. So if I type with other, okay, that will return the ID of the particular instance that we've just hit in this collision, okay? So with other, and this works in the same way as an if statement. I could type something to happen at the end here, or I can open a set of curly braces and type in a bunch of resulting actions here, which is what we're going to do, okay? So with other, HP equals HP minus 1, and semicolon, there, okay? So with the enemy object reduce, with the instance of obj underscore enemy that we just hit, reduce its hit points by 1. And then the only other thing we want to do, applying this time to the bullet instance, is say instance underscore destroy. So we'll get rid of the bullet after actually touching the enemy, okay? And then the very, very last thing we want to do just before we run the game and test this out is go to our enemy object and add the event for a collision with rid of.
Alors, 8 other. Ouais, désolé, on me parlait. Hop. Instance destroy.
The bullet after actually touching the enemy, okay?
Là en gros je suis obligé de mettre en plein écran parce qu'ils zooment pas sur le code et j'arrive pas à lire ce qui est décrit, sinon ça fait trop chier. Du coup j'ai essayé de faire que quand je passe en plein écran, tu vois toute la vidéo normalement.
And then the very, very last thing we want to do,
Mais le truc c'est que quand je mets en plein écran, vu que j'ai que deux écrans, ça je vois pas si t'écris dans le chat.
Okay, so if this particular
Alors, ennemi, créer collision, player.
Instance of obj underscore enemy touches our player object at any time, what do we want to happen? We're going to keep it really, really simple for now and just type game underscore restart, okay? It'll just restart the whole game, not meaning game over or anything like that. That's something we can do at a later date. We're just going to make it so it's mechanically functional for now and just say game restart. And that should be enough. So go ahead and run the game either by clicking that or pressing F5. And you can see now when these guys get closer, well, as you can see, what they are actually touching the player there, it just doesn't look like it, and that's something we'll cover in a second. But you'll see if I shoot at these guys.
Ok, donc en gros, normalement, si je me fais toucher, ça doit restart le jeu. Attends, je vais faire un truc, c'est que je vais modifier la room. Donc moi je peux le tuer, et lui quand il me touche ça reset. Donc je vais me laisser crever. Tac. Ok, ça marche ça. De toute façon je pense que je vais finir ce tuto et je vais aller manger quoi. C'est-à-dire j'aurais fait 3 tutos sur 8, c'est déjà pas mal en 2 heures.
Now they get destroyed. And you'll notice that the bullets destroy seemingly a bit early, and you'll notice that the enemies seem to touch the player a bit early, like they're not actually covering one another. So why is that? Well, that's what we're going to fix now, okay? The problem is, if we go to SPR_player and open down here what's called collision mask, you'll see the problem, okay? This is our collision mask for this sprite, and any object that uses this sprite.
Ok, c'est ce que je me disais, tu sais, que quand je touchais à un truc, en vrai il me touche pas, mais ça me tue, tu vois. En gros, du coup, c'est ça, c'est que le sprite là, comme le gars il dit, c'est le rectangle en fait. Du coup, ça touche le rectangle, ça crève direct.
This is the box that the game is using to tell whether or not an instance with this sprite is colliding with another instance. And as you can see, it covers all kinds of space around the player that is not actually touching the player. Okay, you can increase alpha tolerance on this to sort of make it fit the sprite more exactly, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is just place them very manually and specifically. You'll notice I'm making this particular box for the player way smaller than the player actually is, okay? And that's just sort of a game design thing. You can do it however you like, but I find generally players tend to forgive you if an enemy, say, it looks like it touched you, but the game let you get away with it. Players tend to think that's fine, and they don't really complain about that lack of realism. Whereas if, say, what happens in our game currently happens and you die even though it looks like the enemy was nowhere near you, players will definitely protest, okay? Say that's not fair, you know, you need to sort the hitboxes out. So I find it's always generally better to err on the side of giving the player sneakily to player way an instance the enemies seem to touch. Well, that's what we're going to fix now, okay? The problem is, if we go to SPR_player and open down here what's called collision mask, you'll see the problem, okay? This is our collision mask for this sprite, and any object that uses this sprite. This is the box that the game is using to tell whether or not an instance with this sprite is colliding with another instance. And as you can see, it covers all kinds of space around the player that is not actually touching the player. Okay, you can increase alpha tolerance on this to sort of make it fit the sprite more exactly, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is just place them very manually and specifically. You'll notice I'm making this particular box for the player way smaller than the player actually is, okay? And that's just sort of a game design thing. You can do it however you like, but I find generally players tend to forgive you if an enemy, say, it looks like it touched you, but the game let you get away with it. Players tend to think that's fine, and they don't really complain about that lack of realism. Whereas if, say, what happens in our game currently happens and you die even though it looks like the enemy was nowhere near you, players will definitely protest, okay? Say that's not fair, you know, you need to sort the hitboxes out. So I find it's always generally better to err on the side of giving the player a sneakily too small hitbox rather than accidentally have one that's a bit too big, okay? That's the side I prefer to err on. But okay, once you've sorted it for the player sprite, you can close that, but then we need to make sure it works for all of our sprites. Like the bullet, like that's way too big. We only really care about this one being on the very tip, okay, of this bullet. Okay, so only like a collision.
Ah, le logiciel, il est vraiment bien fait, je trouve, hein, quand même. Pour débuter, c'est pas mal, hein. T'as du code, mais t'as aussi du graphisme un peu et tout. Je pense quand je vais commencer à regarder pour faire des dessins un peu genre faire genre rien qu'un décor, des arbres ou genre une maison, tu vois, ça peut être marrant.
With this space should really count. Okay, let's close that. Open sb_enemy.
Non, le logiciel il est payant, mais là je suis sur la version gratuite. Du coup, c'est pour ça là, c'était pour parce qu'en fait je me tâtais à l'acheter le logiciel, mais je me suis dit ouais, si je fous 40 € dans un truc et que j'aime pas, c'est ce que je veux dire quoi.
And just set this one to be a bit smaller as well, so that we're definitely certain of any sort of collisions going on there. Okay, that should be good enough. You can set those to whatever feels right for you, and you can play and test them, but I'll show you now what sort of difference this has made. So you can see now it's much closer, like the bullet's actually having to touch the enemy object there, and if I run that again just to show you the game restarting as well, when we touch an enemy, they actually have to really definitely touch you. You can see there for the game restart to actually happen. So it's a bit more fair, a bit more what the player would actually expect playing the game, okay? That's everything for this tutorial. In the next part we're going to look at adding some tiles and a background, and making a moving camera, and just sort of putting you in an actual game world rather than just this sort of limited, simple black rectangle of space that we're currently playing in, okay? Hope to see you guys then, hope you're enjoying this so far, and I'll see you all on part 4. Thanks guys.
Je vais rajouter plus d'ennemis là. On va tester comme ça. Donc si je me fais toucher, je dois reset. C'est fun quand même. Bon après c'est un délire, hein, c'est du codage quoi. Sûr que quand tu codes un truc qui te plaît plutôt qu'un truc que t'aimes pas, ou que tu te dis ah ça sert à rien, c'est déjà plus facile quoi. contre, j'arrive pas à déplacer le joueur, là, je sais pas pourquoi. Ça, je comprends vraiment pas pourquoi. Ouais, j'ai mis le lien là sur le stream.
See you next time. Hello everyone, welcome to part.
Ouais, du coup, je pense que je vais aller manger là. Du coup, va falloir assimiler un peu tout ça. Donc, soit je continue tout le projet. Je pense que je vais faire tous les tutos. Et après, genre, je referai. Comment dire. Et après, j'essaierai de tout refaire sans la vidéo, je pense. Je relirai un peu. Faudra que je revérifie un peu les trucs. Après, je sais pas s'il faudrait que je regarde un truc, c'est si je vais dans Sprite. Je sais pas si on peut changer genre les couleurs ou un truc comme ça là. Modifier l'image. Voilà. Enfin bon là je vais faire un truc un peu en mode YOLO pour tester mais... Si je fais ça là... Non ça marche pas. Ça sert à rien ça. Ouais, je sais pas trop comment je peux faire mais au pire comme ça là. Faudrait repasser, tu zoomes à fond et tu refais le truc. Enfin bon après je fais pas du dessin donc... Mais bon, il y a moyen de retoucher les images en tout cas. Après je pense un mec qui s'y connaît un peu soit en Photoshop, soit qui s'entraîne un peu sur ça, il peut faire des trucs. Bon après moi je suis un peu nul en dessin mais bon. Je pense qu'il y a quand même moyen de faire des trucs sympas quoi. Ouais, bon, du coup on m'appelle pour aller manger là. Hop, attends je reviens vite fait. Ouais du coup je vais pas tarder à aller manger, je vais faire comme hier là vu qu'il y a les 20 encore du French Roast Stream sur le ZFM là qui fait le comment ça s'appelle slash host. Ils font des speedruns pour essayer de récolter des fonds, donc c'est assez cool. Allez, bah du coup, bah merci d'être passé. Bon appétit si vous allez manger, sinon bonne digestion si vous avez déjà mangé. Et à tout à l'heure. Du coup, je pense que je vais continuer cet après-midi, essayer de finir les 8 tutos et voir un peu ce que ça donne. Et après, je pense que je vais essayer de refaire vite fait des petits jeux. Mais je ferai des formes faciles, tu vois, des rectangles, des carrés, des triangles, des trucs comme ça là, en mode ennemi, joueur et tout, pour faire des tests. Après, pourquoi pas tester des trucs en 2D, en mode platformer et tout. Et plus tard, pourquoi pas faire des tests de mélange des deux, toujours avec des formes faciles, mais bon. Après, on pourra s'attaquer un peu à des trucs graphiques, mais bon, pour l'instant, j'ai pas le niveau. C'est vraiment là, c'est là, je tâtonnais, c'était ma première matinée dessus, quoi. J'ai passé 2 heures dessus. Donc voilà, voilà. Bon allez, bah du coup, bah merci d'être passé, et comme je disais, bon appétit, à tout à l'heure ou à la prochaine. Allez, ciao ciao. Hop.